Thank you for coming. Welcome. My name's Renee Chang. In case you have not met me yet, don't feel left out. I've only been here for about 10 days. So if I haven't met you yet, I hope I will. I am the new Dean of the College of Built Environments. Very happy to be joining your community here, and really wonderful to see the depth and breadth of the community that is represented here in the room. I definitely want to thank John Sloffelberger, who was the former dean, for all the great stewardship and leadership that he has exhibited and is really evident in the college that I come into. And he was the one who really set up this dean's lecture series. So I get to stand here in front of you and be the dean to welcome you, but it was John and Megan Amon who did a lot of work to set this up. So I'm happy to take credit for it and to welcome you all here. There's a great continuity, I think, between John and I, and certainly Megan is the point of continuity as well. So I will actually be introducing Brandon Bourne, our faculty member, to introduce our speaker today. But I just wanted to say a few words of welcome and to also mention to you briefly, some of you participated in an intensive 3-day listening, learning, and planning dialogue that I started as an internal discussion within the faculty, staff, and some student leaders in the College of Built Environments. It was a wonderful, refreshing drink from the fire hose for me that allowed me to catch up and understand more about the college. When I'm starting as a new dean, I don't feel like I'm starting from scratch. I feel like I'm adding a new chapter to a book, and I'm using this time to read the book, to speed read the book as much as I can, and to hear from you all as the experts who understand this college, understand its potential, and have a real appreciation for its role. I know enough to say that the commonality around equity, diversity, and inclusion, around the place of Seattle and the intense issues that are happening around here, to know that these are really important to you all and important to society and a real exemplar to the world who's really looking to Seattle, really looking to communities like the University of Washington, and certainly a college with a name like the College of Built Environments, has a voice and has a responsibility to step up and host these kinds of discussions. Even if we don't end up agreeing and saying this is the one way forward, the dialogue that we can begin to foster and continue to foster through this college is really critical. And so I'm very proud that this is one of the 2 lectures that will be advancing this dialogue. The other one, in case you haven't heard about it, will be April 10th. Michael Ford on hip-hop architecture. It'll be at a different location, Kane Hall, but it will also be at 6:30, and again, the RSVPs would be encouraged. So I'm very happy to be able to open this, and I'll let Brandon give more of an expert setting of how to view this lecture in the context of Seattle, because I'm really just new here, and he has a much better context. So Brandon Bourne.
What a great turnout. This is terrific. Thank you, Dean Chang. It's really an honor for me to welcome our distinguished speaker, Dr. Lance Freeman, to the College of Built Environments. Before we get started, I just might ask that you reach in and check your telephones and make sure that the ringers are off. Take a moment. Does this mic work, by the way? Are you all able to hear me in the back?
Yeah, Lance is checking his phone.
So, while it might suffice to say that Dr. Freeman is a professor of urban planning at Columbia University in New York City, and he's the author of 2 books, There Goes the Hood, Views of Gentrification from the Ground Up, and the forthcoming, A Haven and a Hell, The Ghetto in Black America, and he's published widely on neighborhood change, urban policy, and housing segregation. I would suggest that that introduction is incomplete. For many of us in the CBE community, the idea of practice is of critical importance. After all, it's where the education that we work on here meets the politically and socially complex environment in which many of us will spend our professional lives. In this regard, importantly, Dr. Freeman is a planner, a field itself dedicated to praxis, and he has experience as a community development coordinator, a city planner for the New York City Housing Authority, and a budget analyst for the New York City Department of Environmental Protection. It's fortunate for our profession and for the students in our colleges and universities when we have faculty with this kind of broad and diverse professional experience. Now, turning briefly to our local Seattle context, which hardly seems necessary given the popular understanding of Seattle nowadays, I'll provide a brief snapshot. Over the past decade, Seattle has been one of the fastest growing cities in the United States. The population projection for our region of 4 million people is to add another 1.8 million people by the year 2050. Driven in large part by an economic boom in the tech sector, we're already experiencing a housing shortage, particularly when it comes to affordable housing, and even more so when it comes to affordable family housing. Surging and persistent levels of homelessness are common across the region, and as is generally a high cost of living, driven in large part by the cost of housing. Our regulatory response, on the other hand, has been slow, reactionary, tepid, perhaps, and predictably supportive of the neoliberal context from which it comes. What this means is that the old joke of what is King County's affordable housing policy, the answer is, of course, Pierce County, is becoming ever more true as people drive to qualify and housing prices across the region become increasingly high. The result has been a wholesale change in large sections of the city of Seattle. Due to our zoning, most of this change has been accommodated in some areas, while not in others like most single-family zones. The residents of new development are often very different from those that once lived there, and displacement is a common theme in conversations from the Central District to the South End. Now, the issues of gentrification and displacement, however, are complex and multifaceted, and Dr. Freeman has really augmented our understanding of gentrification, which is actually a global phenomenon and not limited to cities like Seattle or New York. He augments this by moving beyond the common and important demographic statistical analyses to include the less common but no less important voices of the people in these changing places. Dr. Freeman's talk tonight, A Haven and a Hell, The Ghetto in Black America, draws from his latest book of the same title and examines the complicated discursive relationship between the two. Please help me welcome to the stage Dr. Lance Freeman.
Good evening. Thank you for inviting me here. I'm really flattered by such a turnout, so I'm really excited to be here, have an opportunity to talk about my work. I'm always excited when I have an opportunity to share with people my ideas, research that I've done. In this case, research that I did for my book. I think for many authors, academics, there's always a fear that what we write will only be read by our mother. So at least, although I don't know if you're going to read the book, but at least you'll hear me talk about it, so, which is good to hear about. So the motivation for this book is based on my background as a planner, as a person who grew up in New York City, as someone who has studied gentrification, residential segregation, and my background led me to what I think is something of a dilemma, right? On the one hand, here's a quote from one urban sociologist who, on the left-hand side, he describes how people react to the process of gentrification. And what he says is, on the one hand, liberal urban specialists rail against the suburbanization of America and the abandonment of cities by the nation's whites. On the other hand, when the very few and highly selected whites buck the trend and stake a claim in the city, they are berated as opportunists and decried for gentrifying the inner city. This is by Douglas Massey, author of the well-known, highly acclaimed book, The American Apartheid. The other image, is an article, an opinion piece written in the New York Times, bemoaning the end of Black Harlem. okay? And I pose this as a dilemma because when you think of the ghetto, as the term implies, right, it's a space that blacks historically were relegated to, they were confined to, right? These were spaces that they had no choice in terms of where to live. Or at least that's one image of it. Yet at the same time, right, you see reactions such as the quote by Douglas Massey and also the image that the picture captures, okay? And you look at some policies that have been put forth to call them dispersal policies. On the left in the 1970s, when George Romney was the Secretary of HUD, he had an ill-fated brief attempt to open up some of the suburbs. Whites, not surprisingly, reacted very negatively to that, but even some blacks were skeptical of it. More recently, we had the Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing Initiative. And even there, the policy, again, was a relatively, I would say, weak attempt to promote residential integration beyond simply outlawing housing discrimination. But again, you saw some of the reactions that were relatively cool towards the idea that we should push towards residentially integrating our neighborhoods or dismantling the ghetto, okay? So why this reluctance, right? That's what I'm saying. That's why I'm posing it as a dilemma. Why do you have this sort of, on the one hand, recognition that the ghetto, right, as the name implies, it's derived from the term to describe spaces that Jews were confined to in 16th century Venice, right? Why do you then see this reluctance or these feelings towards the ghetto that are not necessarily consistent with that, okay? So I wanted to answer this question by looking at the ghetto from the perspective of blacks, right? What did the ghetto mean as an institution to black Americans, right? A lot of what has been written about the ghetto has documented the extent to which blacks were subject to discrimination, redlining, white flight, and I think it's very important to remember and document that history, but it kind of leaves blacks out of the equation, right? Blacks also have agency. They played a role in this process, and I wanted to document what that was. How did blacks react to these processes of housing discrimination? What did the ghetto mean? How did blacks view these spaces? So that's what I attempt to do with this book, A Haven in Hell, and the remainder of my talk here this evening, I'll just briefly share with you some of the highlights of it. Of course, I'm not going to be able to cover every detail in the book, so I'm going to be giving you somewhat of an overview. But the basic idea and the argument that I will be making is based on research that I've done looking at several different types of sources, including census data, the black press, fiction, biographies, contemporary reports and studies, and histories that have been written previously, okay? And I'm focusing on what I call the northern ghetto, right? So I'm focusing on the states outside of the old Confederacy, the 11 states that made up the Confederacy. I do that because I think the circumstances were different enough in those states that it warrants separate treatment. And I think I had to focus the book in some way. So I focus on cities outside of the old Confederacy, and I'm defining ghettos as urban black neighborhoods that have a cross-section of the black population, including the black poor, okay? So my main argument is that through its history, the northern ghetto has been both a haven and a hell, and a haven meaning a space where blacks could go and actually advance themselves, okay? And it also has been a hell, right? So it's also been a space that has served as a detriment to upward mobility for blacks. And I think what's key is that it's the historical context that defines which role is most prominent, okay? So For those of you who are unfamiliar with this history, you might ask, well, how could the ghetto be a haven? And I'll start by going back in time, going back about 100 years, and thinking about the historical context that we were in at that time, okay? The mass of black people at that time were residing in the South. They were disenfranchised due to Jim Crow laws that were passed in the late 19th and early 20th century. Blacks in the North could vote, but their numbers were very small. So relatively speaking, blacks were without political power. This was also the time period of what I would say uncontested, almost uncontested white supremacy. And what I mean by that, many of the blacks in the South were just one step out of slavery. They were literally almost living in serfdom, okay? This was also at the time when Europeans were colonizing much of the African continent. So if you look around the world, not only in the United States, but blacks were in a very disadvantaged and marginalized position in the late 19th and early 20th century, right? This is the heyday when the Ku Klux Klan came to power, Jim Crow laws were being passed. Much of the gains that were accomplished during Reconstruction were being stripped away, okay? So this was sort of the nadir of black progress after the Civil War, you could say. So blacks reacted to that though, right? Particularly younger blacks who were coming of age with no memory of the slavery, right? They were adopting new attitudes and new perspectives. They were also influenced by the World War, both the rhetoric of the World War, right? Woodrow Wilson's 14 points, his notion that we needed to fight to make the world safe for democracy, the principle of self-determination. Never mind that he was a white supremacist himself, but he had really good rhetoric. And also the experience of fighting in the war, right? Many black soldiers went to Europe and fought in the war. And so as a result, you start to see a new perspective, new attitudes, what was commonly called at that time the new Negro coming of age, right? These were blacks who were more militant, right? Who had conscious self-pride in their race, right? As evidenced by the rise of the Marcus Garvey movement and also the Harlem Renaissance, which was an artistic movement that was aimed to show that blacks could create art, right? That they were deserving of the same political and civil rights as anyone else because they were capable of creating art, right? And so I argue that in some ways the ghetto, right, which we might typically look at as a space of confinement, a space of discrimination, which it was, but it was also in many ways a spatial manifestation of the new Negro movement, right? Because blacks were taking it upon themselves to move from the South to these urban northern neighborhoods, right? And sometimes they had to do it at great expense to themselves and to overcome significant obstacles to do that. Many times, whites or their employers tried to prevent them from leaving, for example, okay? And in doing so, right, blacks were leaving near serfdom in many parts of the South and entering into the modern age, right? They were coming into cities. They were establishing modern institutions. They were making economic gains, right? If you look at economic census data from this time period, you see the blacks that were moving to these neighborhoods were much more upwardly mobile than blacks in other parts of the country. Blacks created economic institutions such as Jesse Binga. He opened a bank in Chicago, became one of the largest black banks in the country, okay? These advances obviously improved the lives of people who were moving from the South to the North, but also just the status of the race and the sense of pride that people took in blacks being able to create these institutions. So again, remember, telling the story from the perspective of blacks, you look at the black press, you look at the way people wrote about this experience, they wrote about this in proud terms, right? They wrote about the fact that we're moving from being sharecroppers, being discriminated against, to modern cities establishing modern institutions. And so it's sort of part of this new Negro movement, I would say. You also see gains in political power as well, right? And many people are cognizant of this. This image on the left is an editorial that was written. The author was arguing that with the movement of blacks to the north, blacks could regain some of the political power that they had lost as a result of the passage of Jim Crow. And of course, you see that manifested, for example, in the election of Oscar the Priest, who first was an alderman in Chicago and then became the first black congressman in the 20th century. And it's important, it was important for symbolic reasons, but also, again, because although ostensibly he represented a part of the South Side of Chicago, because so many blacks in the South had no vote, he also represented them. Right? So it was an important advance in that manner. And so in the early years when the ghetto was being formed, the early 20th century, you can say, I can argue that the ghetto also played the role of a haven, okay? But you also start to see the problems cropping up very soon, okay? So for example, in 1928, a study of 14 cities found that only about a third of black renters had inside toilet facilities. And as late as 1939, another survey found that only 58% of the structures in the Douglas section of which formed the heart of the Black Belt in Chicago had private bathroom facilities, right? So already you're starting to see evidence of slum housing and the problems that occurred. You also see it in some of the fiction that's being written starting in the 1920s, right? You have authors like Ann Petrie, who wrote a book about a novel about the experiences of a single mother in Harlem, or A Native Son by Richard Wright. Both of these authors describe in excruciating detail the struggles of living in these ghetto neighborhoods, right? They talk about being overcharged by landlords. They talk about being exposed to crime. They talk about decrepit housing. And they also highlight the fact that they feel like they're being hemmed in, right? They cannot leave these spaces. Okay, so already, right, you're starting to see this duality, this right, where the ghetto, as I mentioned, is a haven, but already you're starting to see some of the problems that we would come to associate with these neighborhoods later in the 20th century, right? So the implications of that, and you start to see this manifested in terms of how blacks reacted towards the ghetto. Blacks were always opposed to discrimination, always wanted to have the right to choose to live where they wanted or where they could afford. But the reactions towards segregation was sometimes contradictory. I think this is underscored. I'll share with you what happened when the federal government, for the first time, started to become heavily involved in the housing market during the Great Depression. So I have two images up here. On the left, you see this is a headline from the Chicago Defender, well-known black newspaper. And the article is calling out federal policy that we would come to call redlining in later years. That is, certain neighborhoods, in certain neighborhoods, predominantly black neighborhoods, it was much more difficult to obtain a mortgage. And if a black person attempted to buy a house in a predominantly white neighborhood, they would be declined a mortgage, right? So the paper is calling that out. They're saying this is a Jim Crow policy, right? And if you look at other news articles, you'll see them likening these policies to what was happening in Nazi Germany during the 1930s. Okay? On the other hand, the 1930s is also the time period when the federal government starts the public housing program. Right? They start clearing slums and replacing it with affordable housing. The reaction there, though, was different. All right? The federal government built segregated public housing developments. So in white neighborhoods, they built public housing for white people. and in black neighborhoods, they built public housing for black neighborhoods. It's obviously very discriminatory, but the reaction here was more positive. Right? And indeed, in some places, blacks demanded that public housing be built specifically for blacks in black neighborhoods. To me, I interpret that as evidence that they see that as a resource for their community, right? Although it obviously is discriminatory, or it's perpetuating segregation, right? But people live there, they come to value their community, and they see the development of public housing there, although it is segregated. And there were some blacks that were pointing out the potential pitfalls of supporting this. But in general, as this headline suggests, the attitude was one of support and advocating for this benefit, right? So you would see this play out in cities across the country, whereby certain neighborhoods were redlined, an obvious case of discrimination. Here's an example of a map of Seattle showing some of the neighborhoods that were redlined in Seattle at the time. And at the same time, public housing, which segregated blacks, was also being developed. And you see this dichotomy in terms of how people are reacting to this. Okay. If we fast forward to the post-World War II era, you start to see this duality again. And by that, I mean, for some blacks, the ghetto continues to be a haven. It continues to be a place for upward mobility. But for others, that's no longer the case. Here I have two images. And what the image on the left, I'm not sure how well you can make it out, but what was happening in the post-World War II era, many blacks had started to achieve a modicum of economic success due to the wartime boom and the post-war economic boom. Many blacks had been born in the North or had lived there most of their lives, their adult lives. And so for them, the ghetto is no longer something that represents the pinnacle of what blacks could achieve. They no longer are looking at this as, wow, we've come out of near serfdom in the Jim Crow South, and now we're living in modern urban cities. Instead, they're looking at whites moving to the suburbs and saying, that's what I want. And you see that reflected, just what I tried to capture with this image. This is an image from a magazine, Our World. If you look at magazines like Ebony or Our World, which were modeled on Life magazine, they wanted to show that blacks were starting to make it. They wanted to highlight black achievement, and they did that by showing blacks living outside of the ghetto, right? So this, in contrast to the earlier generation, whereby blacks were looking at just moving to the ghetto as a step forward, now people are starting to say, that's not enough. We want what the white middle class has. Yet at the same time, you still see this chart on your right shows the number of blacks moving outside of the South, and you start to see the largest numbers of blacks leaving the South at this time. You also start to see sizable numbers of blacks moving to West Coast cities, cities like Seattle, Los Angeles, Oakland, and you start to see ghettos forming on the West Coast for the first time, although not to the same extent that you would see in northern and eastern cities. But the point underscored by that image is that while many blacks are trying to leave the ghetto, you still see large numbers moving in to these neighborhoods. Urban renewal also highlights this duality, right? Urban renewal, the policy sometimes referred to as Negro removal because of the frequency that it targeted predominantly black neighborhoods. So on the one hand, some blacks saw urban renewal as an opportunity to break up the ghetto. blacks like Robert Weaver, who would go on to become the first Secretary of HUD, thought that we could use urban renewal to demolish slum housing, build new integrated housing outside the ghetto, and that would be a way to attack the segregation that was reaching its zenith in many northern cities. On the other hand, many blacks were reluctant or skeptical of this, and this article sort of speaks to this, right? Many blacks saw the notion of breaking up the ghetto as something that would be taking away their hard-fought gains in terms of acquiring residential space. To some extent for practical reasons, because the question was where are they going to go if they are displaced through urban renewal, but also because, again, they had built institutions there, they had built a community there, and so you had many people, all who also had a vested interest, black politicians, black businessmen, black churches. So you have, again, this dilemma whereby some people are advocating that we need to break up these communities. Others, though, are very skeptical of that idea. You start to see in the 1950s, and this chart shows this, the decline in the population density in predominantly black neighborhoods, the red line being neighborhoods that are 90% black, the blue line neighborhoods that are 50% black or greater. And so what you're starting to see by the 1950s and into the 1960s, blacks are starting to leave the ghetto. The common perception is that this started after the passage of the civil rights laws in the 1960s, but really you start to see it even earlier. Blacks are starting to leave these neighborhoods starting right after World War II. What happens, though, is they typically are being replenished or replaced by other blacks that are coming from the South, okay? So by the middle of the 20th century, the ghetto is starting to lose some of its luster, right? People want to achieve the American dream. It's still serving as a haven for some people who are coming from the South, but in general, blacks are not necessarily looking at the ghetto as a space for aspirations, you know, at least if you look at the demographic data. However, there was an ideological movement that I think would, again, thinking about the historical context, there was an ideological movement that again would put the ghetto, would place the ghetto as a haven, and that's the Black Power movement that came about in the 1960s, right? So during the 1960s, right, this is the civil rights era, much of the focus and attention was on the South, at least in the early years of the civil rights movement, but you start to see in the 1960s a resurgence of black nationalism. It had antecedents from abolitionists like Martin Delany. I had mentioned Marcus Garvey earlier. You had the 49th State movement, the Exodusters. And for many of them, one common theme was the notion that blacks needed their own physical space where they could live autonomously free of white control. Right? And this is a quote from Malcolm X. Revolution is based on land. Land is the basis of all independence. Land is the basis of freedom, justice, and equality. So you have this growing ideology of black nationalism. And if you think about some of the places that people talked about, right? People talked about, like Marcus Garvey, Martin Delany talked about, you know, maybe moving back to Africa or the West Indies. The Exodusters moved to parts of the Midwest. Some people argued that parts of the South should be set aside for black people. If you think about it, though, none of these ideas are very practical. I mean, they're really pie in the sky if you get down to it. The likelihood that a separate black, autonomous black space could be created in any of these areas is or when I say, I shouldn't say black, I should say black American, right? Or that black Americans could go to Africa and carve out their own autonomous space. It's pretty unlikely, frankly. But instead, what we saw, what actually happened, right, blacks did establish an increased degree of autonomy in certain spaces, and those spaces happen to be in ghetto neighborhoods, I would say, right? So the 60s is a time period, those of you who have a planning background, you know this is a time period when a lot of political and planning power, there was a move towards decentralizing that power, devolving some of it down to the neighborhood level. So you see this movement happening, and the ideology of black power is manifesting itself in a number of ways. It's manifesting itself in terms of black culture and also black politics as well. In terms of, oops. Okay. All right. Sorry about that. So you see this again in the Black Arts Movement, for example, right? So it's the second time in the 20th century where you have an artistic movement that is being put to political ends. The Black Arts Movement, in contrast to the Harlem Renaissance, though, with Harlem Renaissance, the audience oftentimes were white people, and many of the patrons were white, although not always, I'm generalizing here. The Black Arts Movement very consciously set out to use art to elevate the black masses and to speak to the black masses, right? And again, so it was in predominantly black ghetto neighborhoods that the Black Arts Movement typically was practiced, right? It was in these spaces where people had an opportunity to hone their craft. It was in these spaces that people could reach the masses of black people that they wanted to elevate through the use of art, right? And so in that way, the ghetto served as a haven for the Black Arts Movement. You also start to see this in terms of politics and the development of institutions, right? So by this time, you increasingly see blacks elected to city councils, state legislatures, congressmen, and even eventually mayors of major cities such as Carl Stokes in Cleveland in 1967, and then after that in a number of other cities as well. And then you also see it in terms of other institutions, right? I mentioned just a few minutes ago, this is a time period when some political power is starting to be devolved down to more community-based, more neighborhood levels, right? So, for example, in many cities, the planning institutions were reformed so that neighborhoods, communities could have some say in the planning process. In many cities, school systems were reformed so that neighborhoods could have some say in the appointment of principals or school boards and the like, okay? And so it's here, right, where black nationalism comes close to manifesting itself, because you now see blacks having control or some influence, at least, over some of these institutions, and it just so happens to be typically in these neighborhoods where blacks are living, okay? So the 1960s is a time period where, demographically speaking, you're starting to see many blacks leave these neighborhoods, yet at the same time, the ideology of black power and the notion that blacks need a physical space comes closest to fruition in these ghetto neighborhoods. All right. So now we're what I'll call at the period of what I call the modern ghetto, the post-civil rights era, right? And again, this chart is showing the proportion of blacks living in majority black neighborhoods. And so you start to see by the late 20th century and by today, the majority of blacks no longer live in majority black neighborhoods, right? So again, this is the evidence of blacks are leaving these neighborhoods. There's a number of sort of large structural forces that are in play, right? You have suburbanization, which started with whites in the early part of the 20th century. By the middle part of the 20th century, in the last decades of the 20th century, blacks are also suburbanizing and leaving the ghetto. You also have deindustrialization, right? So many of the economic opportunities that had drawn blacks out of the South in the first place, those are declining. And the South itself has changed, right? The South, you no longer have Jim Crow. The economy of the South has modernized, okay? And so the biggest change in many ways was the fact that you no longer have young, upwardly mobile blacks leaving the South in large numbers to come to these neighborhoods, right? And so the vitality that any young migrants typically have is gone because they're no longer migrating from the South to the North, right? And so here, this is an image of Freddie Gray, who was tragically killed by the police in Baltimore a few years ago. But you look at the neighborhood he grew up in, and it sort of fits all the negative images that we might have of when we think of the ghetto as a negative, in terms of the negative connotation associated with it. Highly segregated, underperforming schools, poor housing quality, policy of mass incarceration, arresting a large number of people, and he was caught up in that, and his life ended tragically. And so this is the image of the ghetto as a hell, and the negative connotation we have with that, that I think characterizes many people's views of the ghetto. But that's not the only one, right? Because we still now have another threat, and that's gentrification, right? And what has been happening here, you're starting to see, this is just a simple, very simple way of measuring gentrification. This is looking at the proportion of black neighborhoods that are experiencing a significant increase in their white population. And you see the last two periods, there's a big increase, right? So if you go back in the 20th century, you didn't see, very rarely you saw whites moving into predominantly black neighborhoods. That's starting to change, and you see that most evidently in the last decade and then in the first few years of this decade as well. This chart just lists some of the cities with the largest numbers of neighborhoods that are experiencing this white influx. And you can see some pretty big jumps in cities like New York, where I'm from, Washington, D.C., and other cities as well. A significant increase in the last decade compared to the last 2 decades of the 20th century. And of course, in Seattle, you see this map. I'm sure if you can make out the lines, but you can see the blue, the census tracts in blue had a significant presence of blacks in 2000, and the orange are those same neighborhoods that experienced a significant increase in their white population. So you can see the central district, that cluster of neighborhoods just to the east of downtown Seattle experienced a significant influx of whites. And you fast forward to the past few years of this decade, you see there aren't that many neighborhoods in central Seattle that still have a significant presence of blacks. And this chart really shows, this is taken from a Seattle newspaper, shows how the proportion of blacks in the central district declined dramatically just in the past few decades. And also a quote from former Mayor Norm Rice, where he says, "I'm concerned and I'm frustrated because I don't know what the alternatives are. This clearly isn't racist," although some people might disagree there. It's economic. The real question you have to ask yourself, is this good or bad? That's what Mayor Norm Rice said in 2005. And across the country, you see this sort of negative reaction to gentrification, whereby people talk about it in terms of feeling like they're being pushed out, right? So we're kind of returning full circle to what I talked about in the beginning of my talk whereby many people are skeptical of gentrification. They see it, this graffiti's depicting it as a form of colonialism or imperialism, right? So if you just think about the ghetto in terms of the experience of Freddie Gray and all the negative connotations, this might not make so much sense, but if you put it into the larger historical context, and we understand that these have been communities for people, it's been a haven for black people as well, it starts to make a little bit more sense. So you can find examples of this type of graffiti, this type of sentiment in many neighborhoods across the country that are experiencing this gentrification. So what could we do about it? I'll just conclude briefly, just talking about some ideas about being an urban planner, what we could think about in terms of addressing some of these challenges, both in terms of the negative forces that have been impacting these neighborhoods and also the threat of gentrification, right? So 3 broad ideas. One is restitution for the role of public policy in creating, maintaining, and depriving these communities, revitalization, and grassroots involvement in the process. So in terms of restitution, this is actually something that Senator Elizabeth Warren has suggested, that neighborhoods that had been redlined receive some type of benefit to try to redress the negative impacts of those policies. So her particular proposal is that you look at census tracts that were declared hazardous by the Homeowners Loan Corporation, for example. She also includes neighborhoods that were impacted by racial zoning during the 19-teens, okay? And her policy would be to provide down payment assistance to low and moderate income households. I don't agree necessarily with all the specifics of it, but I think the idea of using public policy to redress some of the previous public policy is one I could get behind, okay? Because it's saying that public policy did play a role in some of the negative outcomes that we see in these communities. Second, in terms of revitalization, there have been a number of proposals over the years to revitalize neighborhoods, going all the way back to urban renewal, model cities during the 1960s, enterprise zones, empowerment zones. One criticism is that the policies tend to focus on places while ignoring the people that live there. The Harlem Children's Zone, started by Jeffrey Canada, is an idea to focus on a particular space, but focus just as importantly on the people who live in those spaces, right? And so in contrast, for example, to the opportunity zones being proposed by the current administration, which may be successful in attracting investment to those certain places, right? If investment occurs in certain poor communities, the investors get a tax break, and might be successful in attracting investment, but it doesn't necessarily do anything for the people that live there. So I would like to see some type of revitalization strategy that focuses on particular places, but also focuses on the people that live there, okay? The Harlem Children's Zone is one model. Under the Obama administration, they started to try to implement something similar with the Choice Neighborhoods program. They didn't get very far with that, but I talk about this in a little bit more detail in the book, but my sympathies lie with a program that targets the people that live in these spaces, not just the space itself. And then also, what do we do about the rising housing prices in these neighborhoods? right? I think affordable housing certainly is necessary. I think we need to do more to target it to specific neighborhoods. Inclusionary zoning could be one approach, for example, because it allows for development if the development also includes an affordable component, right? So that can work in a gentrifying area where you see market rate development, but at the same time, it would also produce affordable housing. We could also use something like tax increment financing to fund affordable housing. Gentrification increases property values, right? So it also increases property taxes. So why not use the property taxes to fund affordable housing? Okay. So this is another way of targeting affordable housing specifically to areas experiencing gentrification. And then finally, we could also use, we could target the low-income housing tax credit or LIHTC program. We could give preferences for development in neighborhoods that are experiencing rapid price inflation or gentrification, right? We could modify, each state could modify their qualified allocation plan in a way so that those neighborhoods are the ones that get a preference. We could also target housing vouchers for these neighborhoods, right? We can say that we're going to set aside a certain proportion of our housing vouchers for people living in neighborhoods that are experiencing rapid gentrification. Portland recently adopted a policy whereby they give benefits to people who were displaced by urban renewal, and I think also the construction of certain highways in that city, right? So people who were displaced by those policies or their descendants also can benefit from the program, okay? So there are things that can be done, I think, to specifically target people who are vulnerable living in gentrifying neighborhoods. And finally, though, in terms of, I'm talking about the role of the ghetto as an institution for blacks. If people really value these spaces and they want it to be a haven, right, the communities will have to be mobilized, right? The community's residents will have to be able to voice their concerns, and people will have to want to stay and remain in these communities, right? If you look at the numbers that I have shared with you, for the most part, blacks have been leaving many of these neighborhoods, right? Ultimately, if the ghetto is going to remain a haven, black people are going to have to be front and center in playing the role in being leaders in those communities, remaining in those communities, and staying in those communities, okay? So that overview, I hope you can appreciate what to me seems like a duality in terms of understanding the role of the ghetto in black life. It's been both a haven and a hell, right? It's played both roles, and I think understanding those roles and the context that influences the role that it plays gives us a more complete picture of the role of the ghetto in black life. Thank you.